having me. I'm Nicole, aka Wild Boho on social media, and I'm always looking for fun ways to combine embroidery and beading, and that's what I'm going to show you today. I'm going to be stitching this freestyle cross stitch design that I'm also going to be beading. This is a great smaller project to get you started with embroidery if you're new to that, get you started with beading if you're new to that. It's a smaller project, so it's not going to take you quite as long to complete as a larger project. It's great for gift giving or even just putting something handmade around your house, which is what I love to do. So why don't we get started with all the supplies that we're going to need today? If you're able to look at my desk, we have, these are from Michaels. These are great. They come in a 4-pack. They are 4 by 4, and it's a little piece of wood, and it has the cross stitch holes that you're going to need in it. So 4-pack, I'm just going to be using one of these today. But it's nice because it gives you the opportunity to buy multiples if you want to make gifts for others. So let's talk about the threads that we're going to need. These are the DMC. This is the cotton redder's mat. At Michael's, it's called the soft cotton. Now, it looks a lot like the stranded floss that you're used to from DMC, except the one difference is that this is not a divisible thread. So when you look at this and we cut it off of the skein of thread, we're using it just as is. It doesn't separate into 6 strands. This is available at a lot of Michaels. I have 2 near me. One has it, one doesn't. If you're unable to find it, you can get it online. And if you really just want to jump into the project and you want to find thread, I think you're just fine with using the DMC stranded floss in whatever colors you want to use. We're also going to need just a markable pencil. This is just something that I'm going to be writing on the wood. It's a freestyle design. I don't love patterns, and so whenever I can just freestyle something onto the uh this that we're going to be using, I like doing that. So every single one that I do is slightly different, and that's how yours is going to be too. So this is just water soluble. It's going to make little marks on the cross stitch board, but those are going to be covered up with other threads. And if you still see it afterwards, it's just water soluble. You can take a little Q-tip with some water. These are the beads I'm going to be using. So now as you watch this class, check out the beads that I'm using, and then yours may vary by color. So I'm using a strand of, these are the 6 millimeter, the bead landing, the Preciosa. They're the Czech crystal beads. You'll see that these are going to add a lot of sparkle to our design. That's going to be our very last step. I'm also going to be using some bugle beads and size 8 seed beads in 2 different colors. And again, you'll see where I'm using them and what colors I'm using. I'm going to be using a size 6 Czech seed bead. And then these are the Toho beads, which are very close to this. These are the E beads. And then one more tube of bugle beads. I also have my scissors, my needles. When you are thinking about needles, 2 things to keep in mind. You want one needle that is going to be thin enough to fit through the holes of the cross stitch board, but also that can handle this floss. So you can check the supply list. I like to have an assortment of needles so that I can just be testing things off and on. And then with the smaller needle for the beads, just make sure that your needle can fit through the beads. 2 optional things that you don't need to have, but sometimes it helps. This is just a Wonder Grip and thimble. And this is helpful if you are, I'll show you when we get to the cross stitch part. It can just be helpful for pulling your needle in and out of the board if it gets a little too tricky with the thicker threads that we're using. And then this is the Celebrate It trim bundle. So you obviously don't need all of this, but board has a little hole at the top, and that's where I just tie a piece of ribbon at the end. So when we get to that part, I'll show you how to do that. So again, any trim or ribbon, I really liked these colors, so I picked this one up. I like to have lots of this available just for whatever stitching I end up doing. I always need ribbon and trim for my projects. So let's get started after we've checked all our supplies out. I separated my 4 boards, and I have one of these, and you can see I've kind of cheated a tiny bit. I've already drawn my flower circle on. So that's what we're doing first, and I'm just gonna go over it again. So with my pencil, I'm just drawing a flower head. You can decide what size works for you. If you wanna look at this and do a completely different pattern, several flowers, absolutely go for it. I encourage that. So it's very simple. You just draw a circle onto this. This gives you an idea of where you're stitching, and you kind of need that to start out. So I'm hoping that this shows up on my camera. It's not super visible, but I have a circle right about here, and you can see that's what it's going to look like. So you can imagine, if you can't see the circle, where it's going to be. So I can set this aside, and I am going to grab my first thread. So this color is the 2315. If you just want to keep track, I decided to go with another color palette, just because after working on this one for so long, I wanted some more colors and I wanted to play around with more colors. So you can cut this right off of the skein of thread. Now I am using probably more than I should be using. When I teach embroidery, I usually tell people to cut about 12 inches of thread, um, because I don't want to be threading and rethreading a needle today. This is just how I'm doing this. So we're going to get our larger of the 2 needles. Now I am not knotting this today. And to thread these thicker threads, I like to press it in between my fingers and bring the needle to that. And usually it has nowhere to go but through the needle, except I cut that a little unevenly. So you just squeeze it nice and tight, bring your needle to that, and then you pull it through. And I usually leave about this much. Now you'll see as I'm stitching this, sometimes my needle just comes unthreaded. So don't worry about that. You just rethread your needle. And I am not tying a knot, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to begin with my flower outline, and this is going to start showing up a lot better when I put my first few stitches in. I'm just starting with a corner of my circle. And now remember, cross stitch is kind of pixelated. Oops. It's pixelated. So you're not able to do a perfect circle with this. I'm bringing my thread all the way through, and I'm leaving about that much of a tail. And I just hold it on the back right now, because remember, there's not a knot. So it would be very easy for this to pull through. I try to, and I say try to because you'll see as I'm working on this, I try to work my stitches all in the same sort of pattern. So for these, I'm coming up at the top, going down to the next little corner, and I'm just using 4 of the holes for this stitch. And so it's a very simple, if you've done cross stitch at all, this is very familiar to you. If not, this is a great beginner stitch. You see, there's my first little stitch, 4 holes. Now my next stitch, I'm just going to go to the very next hole, and these are going to be sharing holes with the stitch that I already did. So I'm going to be going down into that hole, pulling my thread all the way through, and making another X. You're going to notice as you're working with this thread, it is a thicker thread, which is great because the design shows up really nicely. I like to use threads where I can actually see my stitches very well. The one tricky part of using a thicker thread is your stitches are going to feel nice and tight. And sometimes as you are bunching them together and stitching lots of them, it's going to feel like your needle isn't going through the hole super easily. This absolutely does work with this thread. And it's just a matter of, as you're bringing your needle through the hole, just kind of pushing your little threads out of the way to make room for that. So I like to do the outline of my circle first. Then that gives me time. I can move around with this project. I don't have to think about my design. I'm just filling in a pattern, which I really like to do. I like to stitch a lot when I'm on the go. I might be moving around in my house from my studio to the downstairs, picking up and putting down my project. And if I can get my outline stitched, then I don't really have to concentrate too much and I can just fill in my stitches. And so I'm just trying to keep my stitches all about the same tension so that they just kind of look nice and smooth. This class, I'm going to be moving from piece to piece. It's kind of going to be like one of those TV cooking shows where you see the beginning of a project and then it goes in the oven, and seconds later, a perfectly cooked meal will come out. So you're not going to be bored watching me stitch this outline. I have the next step, but I just want to show you how I get started. And so there's my top row. And now I'm just bringing my needle. I'm going to just start the little diagonals of my circle. And like I was saying before, cross stitch kind of pixelates things. I think, well, I have kids and they play Minecraft a lot, and I'm picturing the Minecraft worlds where everything is slightly pixelated. That's what this reminds me of. It's a flower, but it's not a perfectly circular flower. It's a cross stitch flower, which I love. And so I would just keep going down here, doing my circle. But because of the magic of cameras, look at that. There's my outline. Perfectly done. And so when I get to that point, I'm starting with a brand new thread. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to just pick a corner and start doing my cross stitches again. Now, when I don't knot my threads, that means that I have lots of threads back here in the background. So what I try to do as I'm filling in an area, I try to also work over my stitches and my loose threads so that they're not going to get pulled out at some point. So as I'm stitching, my finger is on the thread. I can see where my next stitch is going to be, and you might be able to kind of see it through here. You can see the thread kind of goes that way. So I just want to stitch over that so that it all kind of stays in place then. And then I would fill in this entire circle. So you can see as I'm working, there aren't any gaps because each stitch that each stitch that you're making is overlapping with a previous stitch. And so we're going to get a nice solid circle here. Now, parts of this project aren't going to be quite so solid, and I'm going to show you how we're going to handle that. But the flower is definitely a solid piece of this project. I'll just finish filling in this first row. You can get the idea. It is the same stitch movement over and over again. It's a very relaxing stitch. I find this, I was never much for cross stitching with a pattern because again, I don't love patterns and having to count the cross stitch pattern out and work with that. I can do it, but I don't love it. This I really enjoy because you're kind of just making your own pattern and then choosing your own colors and filling it in, which is very relaxing to me. So here's my first row. Oops, we're having a little knot there. Now, what you can use the gripper thimble for, I just wanted to show you before I move forward. So let me do one more stitch. As you get a densely packed area of stitches, it can be a little tricky sometimes to pull your needle through. And so this helps me sometimes. I don't love stitching with thimbles, but sometimes because I've got lots of threads here, it just gives me that little extra grip to pull through and not struggle with my needle so much. So that's what I recommend this for if you are struggling with the thicker thread and the tightly packed stitches. Definitely just grab a few of those. You can use that grip and thimble. It's really helpful. So this is how it looks when we start filling it in. I'm going to cut this thread. And then we have our flower head. Now we're not beading this yet. We are going to bead the stem first. So again, I've drawn some of the lines, but I wanted to show what it looks like. I just gauge where I want my stem to be. So this is what I'm stitching next. It's just a solid line. It's not going to go all the way to the bottom because there's going to be a border of a woven cross stitch and more cross stitches, which we'll get to. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16 bugle beads that we're going to need in this section. So I'm going to pull out my other needle. Sometimes with the bugle beads, you need a slightly thinner needle. And I'm just using a thinner thread for these. You don't really want to use the same DMC thread that you're using, the thicker thread, because it's not going to go through the bugle beads great, and the beads might actually shred some fibers off of this thread. So don't go through the whole headache of doing that. I'm going to thread this needle the same way. And I'm also not going to tie a knot, which feels very weird to me because when I'm stitching on fabric, I'm always tying knots. The way that I'm going to secure these threads, though, is I'm just going to take my needle and run it through a few of the stitches in the back. And I'm going to do that twice to keep my needle or to keep my thread in place. So you can see it's just running through those stitches. And I'm just making sure that I end up with my needle and thread close to the area where I'm going to be stitching the bugle beads. This is another area where that thimble might come in handy to just grip some of your threads. And you want to make sure it feels nice and tight. If it feels loose at all or like it's moving, do that one more time. So I'm just going to do one more time. Again, this is the back of your work. I call this my hoop guts. Usually I'm stitching in an embroidery hoop. I love to see the back of my work. I like to see all of the threads and the bits of things that I've done. So don't be embarrassed by that. That's all of your hard work right there. So now I'm going to bring my needle and thread up. I'm coming up right at the base of one of my stitches. So you can see from the side, it's right on this row because I want it to be nice and closely stitched with the flower head. So I just pull my needle through and I'm going to grab a bugle bead. You can lay it down on the board to see how far it's going to stretch. And that's where you're going to take your needle down. I've gauged that it's about 3 holes of this board. So your needle is going in here and in here. So it's about 1, 2, 3 holes that you're going to do. And then you're just going to line up each bugle bead with the previous section. So I'm going in and out of the same holes all the way down here. So I'm making sure that I'm always going in this one and in this one. And we're going to stitch our row of bugle beads. You only need to go through these beads one time. You'll feel that they are nice and secure and they're not really going anywhere at all. I do like to pull the thread tight, but you'll gauge your tension as you're stitching this. You just don't want them moving around. So as I'm stitching, I'm just making sure that they are laying in place just right. This is going to give it the shine and some more visual interest. And I like the combination of the matte thread, the cotton matte thread that we used for the flower head, and the shine of the bugle beads. That is one of my favorite parts of adding the beads to my embroidery. It just highlights things that I love about the thread and the design. So we're going to stitch these bugle beads on. Remember, not going all the way to the bottom. We want about 5 holes left at the bottom for our border. So just keep that in mind if you're trying to do the same design that I am doing. Alternatively, when you start working through this project, you could always do your border first so that you don't have to think about that and you just have your border done first. So I would stitch all of my bugle beads on. I think I can probably end there. When you get to the end of your row of bugle beads, you don't want to just cut your thread because it's going to loosen over time. So what I like to do, make sure that's nice and tight. I'm holding on to the beads from the front so that they can't go anywhere. And I'm just going to take my needle and go through a few of the beads. And I'm going to do this a few times. And I'm going to work my way up to the stem. I want my beads to be secure. I don't want these falling off. I always worry about beads falling off of my work and scattering. So normally whenever I work with beads, I do tie a knot at the end. And so I've found that the safest way for me to do this, to feel like it's nice and sturdy, is to take my needle back up to the flower head and I tie my little knot up here. So I'm going to just go through a few of these stitches again. This is the tricky part where you might need your little gripper. And I can just loop it through and tie a little knot that way. Just take my needle through. And if you're really, really worried, just let your needle travel through this. Make sure you're not taking it through to the front of your project. You can check that out. I don't see any green thread. You can take it through, pull it nice and tight, and then trim that. And then if it goes anywhere, it's just working its way back into the purple part of that flower. So from here, we are going to work on our leaves. These, again, I have freehanded on. This is what we want. This one I have drawn to the end. And then this one I have it so that it's cut off. So you can imagine that it continues beyond the edge of the border. And so again, same thing. You decide how you want your leaves to look. I want this one to be the fully shaped leaf. So when I start stitching it, I'm going to be starting at the edge so that I can make sure that it is a fully shaped leaf and doesn't get cut off. So I drew both of my leaf shapes on. Now I have two different color greens. When I stitched this, I have lots of visual interest going on here with the beads on the flower head, but this leaf and this leaf, I just have beads along the outer edge. And so I wanted there to be some color difference in here. So I have two different color greens, 2469 and 2906, the two different colors. So just pick one of your colors. And again, I'm starting probably with more than I normally would for a project, just so that I don't have to keep starting and stopping with with my thread. And I'm not going to tie a knot. And I'm going to start this one at the outer edge. And so I'm going to be stitching a diagonal line up this way and following the shape of my leaf. And so we're back to our same cross stitches. I'm pulling all the way through. I don't want my thread as I'm stitching this one to be hanging out here. I don't want it to be hanging off the edge. So as you are pulling it through, just make sure that you're holding it to the inside and that you're going to be working over that thread to secure it into place. And so I'm going to start with my little diagonal line. And remember, if you start stitching this, you've drawn the pattern, you've freehanded your pattern on, and you're stitching it and it isn't looking right, the worst thing that happens is you cut your thread out and you start over again. Don't get super stressed out with this project or with this process. Try and take it slow and don't feel keyed up. Because again, worst thing that happens, you cut your thread out and you start over and you lost a little bit of thread and time. That's not horrible. So I'm making my diagonal lines for my leaf. Another thing that's nice about this, if you feel like as you've stitched it, you haven't added quite enough to it and you want to bulk it up a little bit more, you can go back and add more stitches to your outline. That's the fun part of this process, really making it your own. So I've got 5 stitches here. I'm going to work a few stitches over now. I think this would be really pretty with even several smaller flower heads and smaller leaves. Was there a question? I'm sorry.
No, Nicole, you're good.
Okay. So I'm just working my way over and then we're going to work back down to the stem again. I just want to show you how I get this outline started, and then we're going to get to a lot more beading of the leaves. So you can see your leaf kind of taking shape here. And now I'm going to work down at an angle. I hope you're able to see the blue lines. As I'm stitching it, they are kind of faint. So I'm thinking you might not be able to see them super great. So just imagine that I'm stitching along a line. If your thread gets knotted like this, don't get stressed. Just try to loosen it. It is bound to happen. And if it's a really bad knot, again, the worst thing that happens is you cut out some thread at the end. I have done that plenty of times. I am kind of a thread waster. If it takes me too much time, I just get impatient and want to move on. And so I'm going to do the same exact thing with this leaf that I did with the flower. I like to do my outline first, and then I like to be able to fill it in. With this one, I would be filling in with two different colors. So I would do one color for the outline of the leaf, and then I'd bring in a second color before I start filling in. And I would just start scattering some stitches. I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Okay, so I've met my bugle beads here. I would continue doing the leaf shape here. Now, say I've come to the end of my thread and I want to add another color. I'm going to cut that. You will see that after a while, this thread, because you're going in and out of a thicker wood hole, it is going to start to twist like that. So if it starts getting too bad, cut shorter lengths and you are just going to have to stitch with shorter lengths, because I did a very long cut of this and it starts to show up in your stitches. So if it gets like that, just cut it and start with a fresh piece because you don't want to mess up your stitches with a thread that's kind of coming loose. Okay, now I have my other color and I wanted to scatter a few stitches throughout this piece. I didn't pull from the right end, so it got like that, but that's okay. If I had pulled from this end, it would have pulled out just right. You can always tell if you've pulled from the right end or not, if it keeps pulling smoothly or if it gets all bunched up like that. Okay, we're gonna thread our needle again. And now imagine that I have finished this outline, and so I wanna fill in this area. So I'm scattering a few, oops, sometimes I forget I didn't knot my thread. I'm going to overlap these two threads here and hold them together as I'm stitching to kind of work them into place. And so I'm just scattering these filler stitches in a different color throughout my leaf shape. And that can either be as little or as much as you want to go. And that's something that you're just going to gauge as you're stitching, how much you want to see with the different colors throughout your leaf. This is going to be a fairly large open area. So, work a few stitches, bring in your other color, see what you're thinking. And then as you bring in your other color and you're filling in, you're just going to work in your rows. And every time you come to one of these stitches, you're just going to be working around it, filling in exactly the same way that we did our flower head. Okay. So here are my finished leaves. Look how quickly I worked that up. My finished leaves, you can see the variation of colors. I hope you can see that. There's my bugle bead stem. And so let's add some beads here. You can see that with my leaves here, I added some of the larger beads. So let's grab those. These are the size 6 beads. And again, I'm not going to be using my thicker DMC thread for this. So you just want to use your thinner sewing thread. And I'm just using my thinner needle too. I'm picking the thinner needle, even though these are larger beads, because I'm going to be going in and out of the holes that already have stitching. So I want to minimize the chance of snagging one of my stitches and pulling at them. And so now you can just decide. I'm going to do the same thing where I start my thread on the back and just kind of make like a little loop so that it's not pulling through as you're stitching. Leave a nice tail. You can always cut that down later. I feel like if you leave a nicer length tail, it also isn't quite as likely to pull out because it just kind of catches like that. So now I'm going to stitch my beads along this outer edge of the leaf. And if as you're stitching this, you want to decide to go through here and add beads too, absolutely. That would be really cool. If you want to stitch your leaf all in just one color and then come through and add little beads, I think that would be a really pretty thing to do. So I'm kind of ignoring the cross stitch at this point, and I am just adding little beads wherever it makes sense that they go. So I'm kind of bringing just my needle up in the holes where I've already stitched, and I want my beads to be nice and close together. And you'll see what I mean by that as you start to stitch this. So you want them to be nice and tight together. So you might have to go through one hole more than once as you add each bead on. You can see that's starting already to look really pretty. Sometimes you have to find where your needle is going to be next. I like these beads that are several colors of green because I think it just adds even more variety to this. And so I'm going to add a few here. I don't want to outline my whole leaf, but I want to add little bits of color and shine throughout this. You can see that the holes don't really matter. As long as the beads are going where you want them, you don't have to pay attention to making cross stitches. At this point, you're just making little straight stitches along this. And if I want to stop here and pick up here, I don't have to cut my thread. I'm just going to carry it. I wouldn't do that if I was going from this spot to over here, because again, this is open right now, and I'm going to show you how we can fill it in, but we don't want tons of threads crossing all over around this. So I would just do the same thing down here, adding some beads that way as I finish my leaf. Now I'm not going to completely finish it because I want to add some detail to the flower. So I'm just going to add one more bead here. You get the idea of where I'm going with it. I would add some along here. I'd tie a knot in my thread, come back here, add a few. I added a few stitches to kind of connect this leaf. I wanted it to be a little bit more detached. So I just added a few green stitches there to end my thread. Same exact thing that I did before. Just run it through the leaf once or twice and tie a little knot so that your little beads aren't going anywhere. You don't want to spend all the time doing this, give it to a friend, and then have it fall apart. That's always what I worry about most with a project where I'm adding lots of beads. Okay, so now let's focus on the flower. We'll move these beads out of the way. I have my size 8. These are the Miyuki seed beads. They're like a pretty purpley blue kind of. I wanted them to stand out against the thread. And then I also have some more bugle beads. And one more time, I'm going to grab some thread. Your thread can match what you're working with, or it doesn't have to. You can kind of see as you are working with this that your thread isn't super visible. So even if you have a thread that completely clashes, I wouldn't worry about it. I don't think you're going to notice it in this project. But if you want to match it to be on the safe side, absolutely do that. So I'm going to start at the base of my flower. I'm doing the same exact thing with my needle. Just getting it nice and secure before I start adding lots of beads. Okay. So pick a spot. And the nice thing about this is kind of like your fabric that you're working on. You don't have to go by the X's. I can bring beads everywhere on this, which is what you're going to see me do. So I'm just going to add 2 seed beads, a bugle bead, another seed bead, and I'm just making a little random pattern that kind of flares out from the base and is going to go like in a radiant pattern from the base of the stem. So just pick an area that you want to bring your beads down, and I'm going to vary where I'm coming up. I don't want them to look too perfect. I kind of want it to look a little off, not super uniform. Vary how many beads and your little pattern of beads that you're using. I think it looks really pretty to mix the bugle beads and the seed beads. And the 2 colors I really like a lot. But you could really go crazy if you've got lots of beadwork. You can do this radial pattern. You could also go around afterwards and add some around an outline if you wanted. I'll do one more strand of this, and then I want to move on to our border stitches. You can add the bugle bead first and then some seed beads. You can see I'm just really not paying too close attention to the bead patterns. I just am placing them where I want them in a radiant pattern, and I'm absolutely loving how that's turned out. And again, here's what my finished version looks like. You can see I even went back then and layered some. So once I have my radiant pattern, I can come back and I can go back over that way again. I could do that with a different color if I wanted to just it gives it more dimension, which is something I'm always looking to do in my projects. So we're going to end this because I want to start the border stitch on this piece. We're going to pretend that this is completely beaded. And I'm going to cut that thread, move my beads out of the way. And now I'm going to add another color. So in this piece, you can see I have this, it's like a pretty blue-gray. In this one, I'm going to be using 2 different colors of orange. Now, this next stitch that I'm going to show you is called the woven cross stitch. It is slightly different than your cross stitch. It's going to add just a little bit more interest to your project. It looks more complicated than it is. It's a really pretty decorative border. And instead of just using a square of 4 holes, we're going to be using a square that's 3 holes by 3 by 3 by 3. So I'm coming to the edge of this project, the edge of the board, making sure my thread is coming down here and is not escaping over the edge. And I'm just going to do a regular cross stitch. So this is exactly like how we did it before. It's just a larger cross stitch. And I'm pulling this one kind of tight. The tension on this one, I want it to be nice and secure in there. And now I'm going to go back through the same holes. So I'm coming up at the bottom of that stitch I just did. and I'm going to go through the top. So I'm making the first of my cross stitches again. I'm just layering it on top of what I already had. This stitch I'm not pulling super tight, and you'll see why. I'm now coming up to make my second cross stitch, pulling it through. Now, before I take it down up here, I'm going to take my needle and I'm pushing that top stitch that we just stitched aside, and I'm going underneath the bottom of the cross stitch. And I'm going to pull my thread through. This is what's going to give us that twisted look. And then I'm going to pull my thread through again to show you what it looks like finished. This is a really pretty stitch. If you want to practice this one not on this and just practice it on fabric to get the feel of it, you can do that. I'll show you that again. So I'm going this, because this is the border, I'm not going back into these stitches. I'm just going to start with a fresh 3x3 area. I'm working from the bottom up with my stitches. So there's my first cross stitch. And then my second one is layering. It's like you're doing the same exact thing all over again. I'm just going right over those stitches. And then it's just your final stitch that's slightly different. I'm coming up. And then I'm taking my needle, I'm pushing the top stitch away, and I'm going underneath the very bottom stitch. So my needle is right against the board at this point, and I'm pulling it through. To keep it kind of puffy, the stitch that is layered on your base cross stitch, you're not pulling super tight. And then you get that nice little cross stitch look. You can see in this finished version how that looks. So there's a slight gap in between each stitch. So we're not working. If we worked into each of these stitches, you'll know that you're doing it wrong, because you'll feel your needle isn't going to want to pull threads through there. And it's because you've already got 2 threads going through each hole. So that's why we're just leaving a little gap. Plus it's the border, so it's okay that it looks a little different. You can also see that when I get to the border around the leaf, I leave a little section there. I kind of wanted that interruption in the border so that you can see it's not a complete border around your project. And then pretend I've done that. I'm going to come back with my other orange to finish this border. We're going to do a few regular cross stitches now. And I'll show you what this section looks like complete in these colors. I just want to show you how we work it, because then we're going to add a few beads to this too. Okay, so we're going to work the border all the way over here and all the way down here. So I just have to make sure that my first stitch is going to be right around here. When you're working this, you won't have to calculate that out because you'll already have your border done. So now I'm just going to do regular cross stitches on the inside of this whole border. Just like that. I'll just show you the first 2 because we've already done plenty of cross stitch, and I want to show you how you can just zhuzh that up a little bit more. So I've been working, stitching, 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 and here we go. Here is our border. Now you can see this corner, and then eventually these 2 corners still has a little open space. And so what better way to fill that open space than with a few beads? That's my answer to everything. If I'm ever not sure about something, just add a bead and it usually solves the problem of what you're doing with your project. Okay, so now these little beads in the corner. I want to kind of be slightly raised. And so I'm going to do the same thing where I'm taking my needle and just running it through, making sure that my tail isn't extending over the edge. Okay, so now I'm just coming up in this hole. You see there's only 3 holes there. And this can kind of be a thicker looking stitch, so it doesn't need to be perfect. So I'm just going to take it down there. And then I'm going to come up in this hole, put 2 more beads on, and just kind of push those beads out of the way. And it just kind of layers them on. You get a little raised effect, just like that. So that's how I finished the border. Now, when you're completely done, you'll notice that you still have empty space on your project, which you don't exactly want because if you're looking at it, I won't use this one. There are threads all over the place. You don't want too much empty space. You can see in this one, I have some empty holes. But what I first did was I wanted to add a little bit of sparkle. So that's when I pull out the Preciosa crystal beads. Now these are a little bit heavier of a bead, and these are an accent bead. So for each one of these, I go through this bead twice. I don't want them falling off. I don't want them wobbling around. I'm just getting my thread started in an area near the top. And again, this is at the tail end of your project. You will see what spaces you want to fill in, and you can just gauge where you want your beads to be. So I'm just picking spots throughout here, adding my bead, taking it down, and then I'm going to come right back up in that same hole again. And I'm just securing it so that it's not going anywhere. Just like that. And then I'm going to scatter them around. I'm imagining where my border is going to come down, so I don't want to extend beyond that. So adding these beads is starting to cover up some of that open space that you have. When you have finished adding, I'm going to add one more. In person, this sparkle is really showing up nicely. I also chose beads the color of the cross stitch board because I want to see them, but I also don't want to focus just on those. So I've added my beads, pretend I've stitched this all. I've knotted this thread, which you just saw I didn't knot. Don't do that. Really, for real, knot your thread. And then I grabbed another color, the 2739. That I found was a really good match for the back of this board. It will let me add stitches to give it some texture, to make it look finished, but it's not going to distract from the rest of my project, which I really don't want. I like the flower, I like the border. This is just to add the finishing touches to this project. So I've got my beads, I've finished adding all of my crystal beads, and now I'm going to come through, and this is the fun part because you're just adding random cross stitches to your background. If you notice an area where you can really see threads through and you don't want to see your threads, add a few stitches there. Really, anything can be solved with some extra thread and some extra beads. That's the answer to any of my projects. So I would just continue adding my crystal beads, adding some random stitches until you come up with this. You can see in my background, I even down here added a few green stitches, and I only kept the crystals up here. Down here, I just added the cross stitch thread. So there is your freestyle cross stitch. I am going to take this one and add it to, I have gallery shelves in my house where I'm always changing up the artwork. I'm just going to set this on my gallery wall. If I did these in, I think this really would be a great gift to give someone. Even though it's small, it is going to take you a little bit to do, but it's a fun project and I hope you have fun with it. Happy stitching.